Hello and welcome. Has Honduras finally resolved its political tangle, or is the worst yet to come? Although it's one of the poorest countries in Latin America, the struggle for control started to become more and more symbolic of a shift to left-wing politics in the region. The country held its presidential election on Sunday with Porfirio Lobo of the Conservative National Party winning. The vote was meant to settle months of political wrangling between the ousted president, Manuel Zelaya, who was escorted out of the country in his pajamas by the military, and the interim president, Roberto Micheletti. The dispute centers around a proposed constitutional referendum that critics say would have paved the way for Zelaya to seek a second term in office. Well, shortly after he was ousted, Latin American leaders and the US called for his reinstatement. But his opponents argued that they were simply defending the country's constitution. In late October, the US announced that it had brokered a deal only to have it collapse just days later, leading Zelaya to call for a boycott of the presidential elections. With the vote now over, much of the region appears in a standoff over what to do. The US is calling it an important step forward, while Latin American countries such as Brazil, Venezuela and Argentina are refusing to recognize the results. So where does all of this leave the people of Honduras, who are largely dependent on foreign aid to survive, which the international community all but halted in the midst of the country's leadership crisis? So on today's show, we ask, what's next for the people of Honduras? Remember, you can join our conversations with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or email, and we also welcome your phone calls onto the show. Well, I'm joined here in Washington by Victor Rico, the Secretary for Political Affairs at the Organization of the American States, or OAS. Previously, he served as the OAS as the Director of the Department of Democratic Sustainability and Special Missions. Also joining us is Eric Farnsworth, the Vice President of the Council of the Americas, an international business organization that promotes economic development and open markets in the Western Hemisphere. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you.
Victor Rico, if I could start with you and start by asking, was this really a fair and free election? Was it actually legal, considering the dispute over the legitimacy of the Micheletti government? How is the OAS treating it effectively?
Well, first of all, we cannot say it was a fair and free election because we didn't observe this election. But certainly there are some facts that we have to consider. First of all, the election that has taken place on Sunday in Honduras was in a fairly peaceful way. Of course, the environment of the election was not the best because President Zelaya is still at the embassy of Brazil. We have an illegitimate government still in power, and one of the candidates did resign to participate in this election. No? The second fact is that the turnout of the election was quite in the historic levels of the Honduras election, around 55%. The Electoral Tribunal says it was around 61%, but some NGO says that it's around 55%, which is quite good, according to historic Honduras level. And the third fact is that the landslide victory of Porfirio Lobo. So it's a political fact that we have to take into account.
Well, let me bring in Eric Farnsworth here. Good to have you on the show too.
Thank you.
The US tried to negotiate the return of Zelaya just before the election, and that didn't happen. And people are asking now, how did the United States manage to make such a mess of handling the Honduras political crisis?
Well, I'm not one of those who thinks that the United States actually made a huge mess of it. I think that the United States played a very responsible role at two key points. The first was, after the coup actually took place, Secretary of State Clinton actually helped create the Arias process with the Nobel laureate and President of Costa Rica, Oscar Arias, to try to negotiate a compromise solution. When that didn't occur, the State Department and White House sent a senior diplomatic team to Tegucigalpa to try to negotiate a path forward in late October, and it's that agreement that I believe you're referring to. That fell apart not because of the United States, but because of the negotiations that were still ongoing between the deposed President Zelaya and the de facto government. So the fact is, I think the United States played a responsible role. The fact that it didn't quite get us to where everybody wanted to be Well, that's diplomacy.
Well, there was a sense, though, that the position of the U.S. seemed to take, swing backwards and forwards along different paths, and that this was really the first test of President Obama's credibility in the Latin American region, and that perhaps he hasn't managed to sustain the credibility or reach the credibility levels he should. So what are the next steps?
Well, there are some people who would say that, and I think that stems from the fact that the United States initially said that they wouldn't recognize the legitimacy of the elections from Sunday unless President Zelaya was restored prior to the elections. When it became clear that that was not possible, though, I think that they, pragmatically recognized that the elections were the best path forward, and as you heard from our earlier guest, in fact, those were handled, I think, in a reasonably fair and free way. This was an important test. But you have a new team in place as well, and I think that there will be other tests. But I think that going forward, the rest of the hemisphere recognizes that the United States has an important role to play in these issues.
Let me get back to you then, Victorico, and just ask about, in terms of since the Micheletti government had taken over and things really took that sort of political tangle, there was a sense that there may be some kind of resolution. And I know that in a letter to President Obama, Manuel Zelaya renounced the possibility of returning to office. And I want to quote what he said here in the letter he wrote. He said, 3,500 people detained in 100 days, over 600 people beaten and injured in hospitals, more than 100 murders and countless numbers of people subjected to torture. All this converts the November election into an anti-democratic exercise under an uncertain state of lawlessness and with military intimidation. I wonder if, considering what you said at the beginning of the show and these sort of comments, what's being done to look into that situation and to try to address some of these concerns if validated?
Certainly, that there has been some kind of human rights violation since the coup d'état take place in Honduras. The Inter-American Human Rights Commission went to Tegucigalpa and made a report about this. And of course, what President Zelaya says is based on this report, and that's why I was saying that this election took place not in the best environment that a democratic election should take place. I think President Zelaya has a point, and this is one of the factors we're taking into account in the areas in order to consider what are the next steps in order to reintegrate Honduras into the Organization of American States.
Eric Farnsworth, there was a sense that the final position the U.S. took on the elections was a result of sort of political maneuvering within the U.S., and there was a sense that President Obama was effectively backed into a corner, held to hostage to the U.S. congressional process, where his nominations were stopped by the Republicans unless he actually, they were unhappy basically with the support of Zelaya. To what degree was Honduras' election decided on sort of political weavings within the U.S.?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that that did occur in the United States. There was some congressional negotiation, discussion, and certainly there was some politics being played. And I think that was a contributing factor to where the United States ended up coming out. But I think the bottom line here shouldn't be missed, and that's really that the people of Honduras voted, and they made their determination, they made their decision, and whatever happened in Washington, really at the end of the day wasn't the story. The story, I think, was the people of Honduras and what they chose to do looking forward for their own country.
Well, let me bring in from the Honduran capital, Tegucigalpa now, we have Berta Oliva, a human rights advocate and founder of the Committee of the Relatives of the Disappeared in Honduras, or COFADE, a non-governmental organization that represents the interests of the victims of forced disappearances. And ask, if you can hear me, what the sense is among the people of Honduras in terms of how this election has, what this election has done for the stability of the country. There's a sense that the people are divided. Let me get your perspective on that, please.
Well, I do believe that it's extremely interesting to ask this question of the Honduran people, and people in the poor neighborhoods, people in communities, and people in rural areas. This will lead to the conclusion that the people are completely dissatisfied. They did not participate in the elections. It was a level of absenteeism never seen before in Honduran elections, in these recent elections. And the absenteeism was so widespread that we believe that what occurred on Sunday was no more or less than a public display which had been convened to give an aura of legitimacy to a military coup which was experienced in our country. However, I also believe that the pragmatism which is applied to countries such as ours, reflects and results in major violations of human rights, which as of today, have not yet been considered as an essential part of our life. It's something that needs to be respected for our populations. The violations of human rights continue. On the day of this public display that was held, there were massive violations of human rights. So you cannot say that these were free elections or that there was a massive turnout. We cannot say that this is what occurred in Honduras. So I believe that if you say that, we're just fooling ourselves, because the Honduran people cannot be fooled. And we should not fool the organizations that had international human rights monitoring here in Tegucigalpa, in the poor neighborhoods, and anywhere in Honduran territory. These organizations may perhaps be the best witnesses of the major violations of human rights that took place precisely on the day of the vote.
Well, Berta Oliva and our guests here in the studio, I'm going to ask you to stand by. We have to take a very short break. We continue our discussion on Honduras' situation when we return in a moment.